Good morning, everybody, on this lovely, cool summer's morning. Yes, this is a talk about UFOs. Perhaps you can see from the little subtitle there. I'm asking the question, are there any images that need an extraterrestrial explanation? It started with the idea that if you look at the statistics, this is a survey carried out a few years ago in America. I really need to update this with a survey taken more recently in Europe. But in a survey a few years back in America, people were asked, have extraterrestrial aliens visited Earth? And an amazing 40% said yes, or probably. If you asked a slightly different question, are extraterrestrial aliens visiting now? Are aliens walking amongst us? You'd think it would be a much lower figure. Well, lower, yes, but not by much. 35% of young Americans back in 2018 thought that, yes, aliens do walk amongst us. This is worrying in itself, especially when you compare it to the fact that, yes, that's less than the number who apparently believe in ghosts, greater than the number who believe in telekinesis or Bigfoot. But the most worrying statistic is the fact that the number of people who believe that aliens walk amongst us now in America is actually greater than the number who believe in evolution, which is 31%. That tells you something about either youngsters or Americans, or maybe attitudes have changed in the last few years. But I rather like this cartoon, which reminds us that the whole business of UFOs being extraterrestrials, or Bigfoot, or the Loch Ness Monster, or any of these things, it really ought to be settled. Because if we look at how many people actually have a camera on them all the time, essentially every waking moment of their lives, it used to be almost zero until the invention of the smartphone. And ever since then, there have been so many cameras going around that surely if these things are real, shouldn't we have a very nice, well-defined image of Loch Ness Monster or UFOs or Bigfoot? When cameras were very rare and people didn't walk around with cameras, it's quite reasonable to assume you see something in the sky, but you haven't got a camera to record it. These days, everybody has a camera in their pocket. So yes, you'd think that it should be settled by now, but no, it's not settled. A little while ago, I did a Google search for UFO to see how many web pages talk about UFOs, not all of them saying that UFOs are extraterrestrial, but basically discussing the idea of unexplained lights in the sky. When I Googled it, I found 250 million web pages that talk about UFOs. So there's definitely a lot of people who still think it's a very hot topic. So it's quite definitely not settled. In this talk, I'm looking at mainly images. I also got sidetracked onto videos as well, but mainly looking at images, asking what explanations can we have for these various images that exist. I would argue that there's 5 categories of UFOs. A lot of them fall into the category of man-made objects, which are misidentified. Some of them are natural objects, which are misidentified. Some of them are purely image artifacts. In other words, they are caught by a camera, but they weren't actually in the sky. It's an artifact of the process of taking an image. It is always possible, of course, that some of the images you might see, especially those on certain websites, etc., might be deliberately faked, because people want you to click on their webpage or their video so that they can get advertising revenue. And the elephant in the room is, there is a 5th category, and that is UFOs might be extraterrestrial spacecraft of visitors. And I'm going to have a look at each of those 5 categories in turn. Let's just make sure we understand the definitions. I'm using UFOs in the conventional sense to mean something seen in the sky that isn't readily identified. And regarding an explanation, I side very much with the astronomer Carl Sagan, back in the 70s and 80s, very popular individual popularizing science. He said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If you're going to say that this image is actually evidence of an extraterrestrial spacecraft, it needs to be very convincing evidence. Otherwise, there's probably a much simpler explanation. And that leads us to the tool of the rational scientist, and that is, if you do ever have two explanations for the same thing, then the explanation for an observation that requires the least amount of speculation is more likely to be the correct one. In other words, if there's two explanations, one of which is very complicated and needs a large amount of speculation, and the other is a much simpler explanation, the simpler one is usually, not always, but usually the right one. So that's often paraphrased as simple solutions are more likely to be correct than more complex ones. Where do you find reliable information about UFOs? Well, you could go to America to a UFO information center like this. You can see it's reliable because there's a little green man sitting on the porch there, who's presumably the one who answers your questions. But you can ask yourself, well, okay, why don't we have pictures like this? It would be wonderful if extraterrestrial spacecraft were real things. Why haven't we got some lovely, clear images? Why do we never have clear, detailed, in-focus images with no camera shake, in other words, no apparent movement of the camera when the image was being taken, well exposed, well focused, etc. That's what we would like to see if these spacecraft are actually visiting us. What do most UFO images actually look like? Well, they don't really look like that. They're much more likely to look like that. A little splodge in the sky. Usually blurred, usually out of focus, usually overexposed, usually combined with a certain amount of movement of the camera. You might look at that and say, I wonder what it is. Let's make it bigger so we can see. Well, you turn a small splodge into a big splodge. It doesn't help you understand what that is. And this is confounded by the fact that when you look at old images, and by old images, I'm sure you remember the pre-digital age when photographs were taken with emulsion film, like 35mm cameras, for instance. You would take a picture, but there was no recorded data about that picture. Now, when you take a digital image, it records, effectively, the phone that took it or the camera that took it. What was the camera? What was the focal length? What was the aperture of the lens? What was the exposure? What date was it taken on? What time was it taken? Etc. All this information is available with a digital image. But before the digital age, we had none of that. So this image, for instance, I have got no idea at all what it is, because I don't know who took it. I don't know when. I don't know what time of day. I don't know which way they were pointing. I don't know what exposure was used. I don't know what aperture of lens was used. I have no information at all other than it looks like a blob. Apart from that, how can I tell what it is? And that's part of the problem with looking at UFO images. And it's particularly looking at images that got me interested in this. It's not the conspiracy theory side of things. It was the idea of, can we tell from an image what it is we're looking at? Because that's part of my research at the University of Liverpool, was image processing and image analysis. I wondered what the earliest recording of a UFO was. And I saw this thinking, that's interesting. This appears to be a wall in Egypt with a few hieroglyphs carved onto it. It appears to show an Apache helicopter in the top left. It appears to show Luke Skywalker's land speeder in the top right. It appears to show a Zeppelin. And I thought, if this was actually carved a few thousand years BC, how can we have all of these wonderful objects? So the first thought is, it's a fake image. It's not a real picture of an Egyptian wall carved thousands of years ago. But actually, it is a real wall carved thousands of years ago. So then you can ask, well, how come we've got a helicopter and a land speeder and a Zeppelin in there? And the answer is, we haven't. That's simply your interpretation of what we actually have. What's actually going on here is that we had two pharaohs that had a little bit of a falling out, and they each carved their own hieroglyphs onto the same wall. And when you look at what's going on in each of these two sets of hieroglyphs from Seti I and Ramses II, there's nothing unusual about those hieroglyphs. But you superpose one on top of the other, here in different colors, then you can get the impression that you're looking at something altogether different. So we have to be careful whenever we're looking at any photo just to understand the context of what it is we're looking at. So let's begin by saying, right, UFOs might be man-made objects. And just to make it easy for us, the United States Air Force, who often have UFO sightings, especially close to their air bases. Of course, there are some air bases in the UK, but there are lots of USAF air bases in America, and it is not that unusual to have lots of people see unusual sights above military air bases. So just to help us, the military have given us this particular identification chart to make it easier. So you may think that these are super secret military spy planes that we're looking at here. No, in fact, we're looking at a weather balloon, a weather balloon, a weather balloon, a weather balloon, a weather balloon. Can you tell what the next one is? No, swamp gas, and then a weather balloon, then a weather balloon, and so you see, yeah, okay, that's just a bit of fun. The USAF, the United States Air Force, all military do not want us to know about their latest secret military aircraft. And that's what some UFOs quite definitely are. Here, I've indicated, perhaps, I'm not sure how well it shows up in this bright sunshine, but here's an image where there's a little bit of a silhouette of a tree, and I think there's a leaf coming into the foreground there. But the question is, these white streaks on the photograph, is this a long exposure image of a fleet of UFOs flying in formation? Does anybody figure out by looking at this what they think it actually is? Contrails, contrails. If it was military contrails, well, that's very odd. Military aircraft don't normally announce themselves by having lots of bright lights. Civilian aircraft don't tend to fly in formation. So what can give an appearance of that? I've deliberately put it into your mind the suggestion that maybe this is a long exposure. In other words, we're looking at objects that are moving into the distance. It isn't actually a long exposure, it's a very short exposure, it's a snapshot. So this isn't a whole load of objects moving, producing contrails in the sky. This image came from a particular web page, which I suggest you go and visit sometime, because it's wonderful. It's called Pylon of the Month. This is Pylon of the Month, December, when was it? December 2019. And yes, I kid you not, there is such a web page where people post images of electricity pylons. And that is what we're looking at. The pylon itself, because this was a very misty night, the pylon itself is not actually visible. If I put in where I think the pylon is sitting, it's there. And now you can see these white lines. What are they? They're the cables that carry the electricity from one pylon to the next. It was a lot of ice, and the ice is simply reflecting light from something just over the horizon, reflecting the light. So this is not a long exposure, it's just a snapshot, and the only reason it looks odd is because without the pylon, you only see the ice on the cables, not everything there. And yes, if you're interested, go and look it up, www.pylonofthemonth.org. Lots of people posting lots of pylons across the UK and elsewhere. These days, there's lots of man-made objects in the sky, especially now certain individuals are putting up rockets every few days to launch new satellites. There's always rocket plumes in the sky to be seen. Not so much from the UK, certainly a lot from various places in America. And sometimes the exhaust trail of a rocket can linger in the sky for quite some time, and air currents in the upper atmosphere can distort the rocket trail into these wonderful clouds. You get this iridescence because of the rocket trails having a certain residue of the rocket fuel. But if you were to see this, for instance, if you were to look up in the sky and see a sight like this, you'd be forgiven to think, this is weird, this is not natural, and I assume that we're seeing some visitation from somewhere in the sky. Only if you actually understood what was happening would you realize that this is a very simple man-made set of UFOs. These are actually a series of sounding rockets. In other words, rockets were launched high into the atmosphere. They released gas which fluoresces because of the sunshine at very high altitude. Some ultraviolet light makes the gas fluoresce, and we see these different clouds of gas fluorescing in different colors. That helps the scientist by watching what happens to these clouds. It helps the scientist judge how the upper atmosphere is moving and how particles from the sun interact with the upper atmosphere to give us, for instance, aurora and other effects like that. So this is simply a man-made sounding rocket experiment. But if you didn't know that was happening, you'd be forgiven to thinking that something really weird is happening here. Many years ago, the sight of lots of dots in the sky, again, might make you think there's something weird. These days, we're much more used to the idea that, yeah, drone shows, you have a little light on a drone, you fly them in constellations of dozens or possibly even hundreds of drones in the air, and you can make them fly in sequence, you can make them effectively generate any pattern you like. So, 20 years ago, that would have been thought to be a UFO. These days, most people would look at that and say, it's just another drone show. Some people say, well, apart from the UFOs, I've seen the landing pads for the UFOs. They're definitely extraterrestrials, because when I looked out of my aircraft window when flying across America, I saw 3 landing pads. I mean, they can't be man-made. Look, they are really weird, sort of triangular type structures. What on earth can those be? Well, either you look at the GPS if you're in an aircraft that tells you where you are, or you simply make a note of the time, and if you know when you took off and when you land, you can work out roughly what part of America you're flying over. And then you use something like Google Earth to look at what's at that particular location. And what do you find? Nothing particularly mysterious. You find a solar plant. This is a whole load of mirrors that are reflecting solar light up to the top there, which generates very high temperatures, which are used in principle either to generate electrical power or to incinerate waste. I'm not sure which particular version that is. But because you've got thousands upon thousands of small mirrors reflecting sunlight, you can get some very odd effects, especially if you're looking down on this from a few miles up as your aircraft flies over. I never really intended this talk to look at videos. I really intended the talk to be, let's look at images and see what we can make of those. But whilst I was looking at images, I kept getting referred to, here's an interesting looking video. And this one kept cropping up time and time and time again. I've taken the audio out because it's an American, and Americans can be quite irritating when they say, wow, look at this amazing thing. There's this cigar-shaped UFO hovering over the lake. This is amazing. This is incredible. And this particular video of a cigar-shaped UFO over a lake went viral when it appeared on the internet, even though about less than half an hour, possibly 5 minutes after it was posted, an explanation came up as to what it was they were looking at. The explanation is quite straightforward. It's the Goodyear blimp. In other words, Goodyear replied to this post saying, we don't want to get in the way of a good story, but that is definitely us. It's not actually hovering over the lake, it's hovering over a football stadium on the other side of the lake. So it's quite definitely the Goodyear blimp. And yet, that posting of, I've seen something incredible, here's a cigar-shaped UFO, that was posted and reposted probably millions of times, even after the explanation was posted and basically, there's nothing amazing here, it's just us. This is a reminder that social media can amplify anything, not simply anything mysterious, it can amplify anything even after you've got the explanation. And again, I wasn't intending to go down this rabbit hole, but as soon as I clicked on one video, perhaps you know what it's like, you get directed at another video, I saw this reference to, here is super clear footage of a UFO. I thought, at last, instead of a blurry, can't tell what it is video, this is a super clear footage of a UFO. So I thought that's probably worth clicking on. So I went for it. See if you can work out what this is. You can see how super clear it is. Bouncing around all over the place. You can sort of get the impression that somebody's got a video camera, they've taken it to an extreme zoom, they've seen something in the distance, they've zoomed in and can't home in on this particular object. After a few minutes, they do tend to settle down, and maybe the photographer has leaned against a wall to try and make it a little steadier. And once it's steadier, you can start to see what it is that they've actually been videoing. So in just a second, it will freeze frame. Can you see what it is now? It's a party balloon. It's a mylar balloon reflecting sunlight, which can give odd colors, especially when you see them at a distance. I would hazard a guess that a certain youngster, perhaps a Jeremy, perhaps a Jennifer, had a birthday party, and the mylar balloon escaped and then went floating off and caused all sorts of people to think, wow, that's amazing. There's something very multicolored, flashing different colors, even though they're seeing it at what could in principle be miles away. If you've got something relatively large in the sunshine, you can see it from a great distance. But as soon as I went down this rabbit hole, I found this quote, which I thought I really couldn't ignore. And the quote, if you'll forgive me reading it out, was this one. Puerto Rico's proximity to the Bermuda Triangle may explain why it's a hotbed of UFOs. And this is what caught my attention. Countless sightings over the years, but many experts consider this next piece of footage to be the gold standard by which all UFO videos will be determined. So I thought, okay, a lot of experts have said this video, which I'm about to show you, is the gold standard for UFOs. So I thought, well, okay, if this is considered to be the best video ever of a UFO, yeah, I guess it's worth having a look at to see if I can figure out what's actually going on. So let's have a look at this and ask, does it stand up to scrutiny in terms of, is it actually an extraterrestrial spacecraft? So the video was taken by the US Customs and Border Patrol aircraft. I figured this is probably worth having a look for a number of different reasons. US Customs and Border Patrol, they take their borders very seriously. And therefore, they have aircraft and very expensive cameras, which they use to patrol the borders, in this particular case, Puerto Rico, to try and figure out, is there an immigration problem, or are the smugglers bringing in contraband into the country? So I figured that the Americans have probably got very good technology. Let's have a look at this video. What they apparently have seen is this black dot. It's an infrared camera taken from an aircraft looking down on the ground, and they are looking at this object. Black in this context means warm, because it's an infrared camera. So the lighter colors mean cool, the darker colors mean warm. So there's a warmish object flying over what appears to be a lake there and flying over a few fields. It appears to be moving quite quickly. It's difficult to judge its speed exactly, but it appears to be moving at a few hundred miles an hour. And it flies over some fields, it flies over what appears to be an industrial estate, it flies over a taxiway, and then it flies over the main runway of the local airport. And people have often said UFOs tend to be clustered around airports and airfields and military sites. What I found interesting about this video, apart from the fact it's technically quite a good quality compared to many videos you find on YouTube, for instance, because it was taken by a high-quality camera in an aircraft, it actually has a lot of useful information. Remember, pre-digital, we don't have that associated information. And if you're dealing with military videos, all of this information tends to be redacted. But here, because it's US Border and Customs, we have that information. And in particular, we have in the bottom left, on every video frame, we have the GPS coordinates of the aircraft. That's what ACFT stands for. So every frame of the video, we know exactly where the aircraft was that was looking down at this UFO. Not only that, but in the bottom right corner, we know exactly where the camera was looking. This is a very sophisticated system. The camera is automatically controlled, trying to follow this UFO. The camera knows which way it's pointing relative to the aircraft, and the aircraft knows which way it's pointing because it has a GPS system and inertial navigation. So we know precisely the GPS coordinates of the point that the camera is looking at, the point on the ground that the camera is looking at. So we know where the camera is, and we know where the camera is pointing. That is very useful information, which you don't always get with videos. The image itself, it's difficult to tell exactly what it is. It appears just to be a blob. Here, it's flying over a field, and I'm guessing that these black blobs in the background, I'm guessing they're probably cows. They're warm, and they're a few meters in size, maybe a couple of meters or so. So perhaps our object is about the same temperature as a cow. It's warm rather than cold, and it's a bit smaller than a cow, so maybe it's I don't know, half a meter or larger in size. When we fly over a road, we see cars in the road. The car engines are much warmer than the rest of the car, and so we get a car which is a sort of rectangle with a dark blob on one side. I took the GPS coordinates of the aircraft and the ground track where the UFO appears to be moving, and I plotted it out. This is the top left bit of Puerto Rico. It's the actual terrain isn't particularly important, but there's the scale, 1 kilometer. Let me just dim that down because it really doesn't matter. But that is the apparent movement of the UFO. I simply took a number of frames of video, took the GPS coordinates, and plotted them out on the map. So that's the way the UFO appears to be moving. It was pointed out by conspiracy theorists, this UFO appears to be moving into the wind. There was a moderate breeze on that day, blowing from the northeast at about 18 knots or so, and therefore this UFO appears to be flying into the wind at 100 miles an hour or more. And therefore, it cannot be a natural phenomenon. Something is definitely propelling this UFO. Okay, I took not only the ground track, I also took the bottom left coordinates, and that is, what is the aircraft doing? So the red are the positions over a few minutes of the aircraft. And for any video frame, we can associate that's where the aircraft was, that's where the UFO was. So I started to link those up to look at the UFO movement. So when the aircraft was there, the UFO appeared to be there. So the UFO must be somewhere on that line. Remember, the blue dot is where the camera is pointing. We don't know exactly where the UFO is along that line, but it's somewhere on that grey line. And then I did the same thing again a few seconds later for a different video frame. I took another point and said, the UFO is somewhere on that grey line. And then I did it again. And then I did it again. And then I did it again. What do you notice about all those grey lines? They all seem to cross at the same place. So you could say this UFO is traveling at hundreds of miles an hour into the wind. Or you could say, well, no, this is entirely consistent with the fact that the UFO is actually static where the black dot is. And the only reason it appears to be moving to the left is because the plane is flying to the right. Of course that's going to happen if you have a camera in an aircraft flying at 200 miles an hour. If you look down at a static object and you're traveling fast in one direction, of course it's going to appear like the object is traveling in the opposite direction. So there's actually no evidence that the object itself is moving according to the blue. That's simply the positions over which it appears to be flying. I continued this. The plane actually flies for quite some distance. Again, that's testament to the quality of the infrared camera that this object was still visible even though the plane continued to fly a couple of miles away. Once it had flown a few miles down towards the south, there was the indication that maybe the black dot had moved a little bit towards the southwest after a few minutes. and remember which way the wind is blowing. So there's evidence that this object is hardly moving at all, and if it is moving, well, it's just moving ever so slightly downwind. So the description on YouTube for this gold standard UFO video was, well, it appears to be a metallic orb. I'm not sure who has decided it's metallic. You cannot tell what it's made of just by looking at a video. And it's a splodge. You can't really tell if it's spherical or not. They say it's moving at incredible speed. Well, actually, you can't determine the speed of the object. With no obvious propulsion into an 18-mile-an-hour headwind, and the comment is, the infrared camera sees an object that does not match anything that we know of. So these experts are saying, we've seen something and we really cannot understand what it is. I would argue that you can't say it's a metallic orb. You can't say it's moving at incredible speed. I sort of agree that there's no obvious propulsion. It hasn't got wings, it hasn't got a motor, it hasn't got a propeller. And it's going into an 18-mile-an-hour headwind. I would argue it isn't. So in other words, we can take all of these things, including this comment that we do not know what technology can possibly produce this blob. I would argue that there's an alternative explanation. If we take into account the motion of the aircraft, the object is essentially static. If anything, it's drifting ever so slightly downwind. I am pretty damn sure that this is just a balloon. And yet, this is the gold standard, they say, of UFO videos. They've simply videoed a balloon and they are coming to all sorts of conclusions. If we revisit this idea that there's no obvious propulsion, well, there's no propellers and no engine for sure. But if it's moving downwind, well, yeah, there is an obvious propulsion. It's the wind that's pushing it along. So everything on the left is basically a very speculative, very involved explanation for what it is we're seeing. What's on the right is a very simple explanation for what we're seeing. It's basically just a party balloon, a bit like the one we saw before, perhaps. Maybe it's a mylar balloon, maybe it's been sitting in the sunshine for a few hours, maybe it's warmed up, which is why it appears warm in the infrared camera. Occam's razor says if you've got two choices, pick the simpler one. And in my opinion, the one on the right is many, many, many times simpler than the one on the left. Let's have a look at natural objects. We saw earlier pylons of the month. Now let's look at cloud of the month. Yes, there is such a thing as the cloud of the month. And we can see all sorts of interesting clouds, including these that appear above mountaintops. This cloud on the right-hand side seems to have a very odd set of little bumps in it. There's nothing actually that unusual about that. It's probably an aircraft circling before it lands at the local airport, producing some disruption to the cloud. You sometimes get these lenticular clouds that look a little bit like flying saucers, but if you see enough of them, you know what it is you're looking at. That maybe doesn't look like a UFO. I just think that looks a lot like the opening sequence of Independence Day sci-fi movie. And occasionally we do get odd-looking things, like occasionally you can get clouds with what appears to be a hole punched in them, as if a large flying saucer has come through the clouds and left a big hole. That's a perfectly natural meteorological phenomena. I'm not going to talk about meteorology, but basically these are natural phenomena. Yes, you can get odd-looking clouds above mountaintops, here above Mount Fuji. Despite the fact that that's a rather beautiful cloud formation, that doesn't stop people taking the image, putting it into some graphics software and augmenting it somewhat to make it look even more spectacular, which is really unnecessary because it's actually quite amazing in the first place. Not so much in this country, but in other, perhaps Scandinavian countries or in Alaska, you can sometimes get these so-called light pillars. It looks very odd because it looks like a whole lot of searchlights are shining into the sky. What are the sources of light? Well, it's nothing unusual, it's just street lights. Street lights normally point down. Why are we getting a whole load of light above each street light beyond our horizon there? It's to do with ice crystals in the atmosphere. Again, that's why you don't tend to get it so much in the UK. But if you get ice crystals, they tend to be little hexagonal platelets. They tend to sit horizontally and act like small mirrors. And so these small ice mirrors floating around in the atmosphere will tend to reflect light from over the horizon, and you get this particular effect. It can be very colourful. The colours are simply the colours of the street lights that you can't see just over your horizon. And if these ice formations happen to be high in the atmosphere, you can get these light pillars way up in the sky, which gives you a really weird sort of scene. It's like you're seeing a city in the sky. And again, if you weren't used to seeing these things, I think Scandinavians are used to seeing it. We are perhaps a little less. But again, there's nothing actually unusual, but it is a rather beautiful sight. Above thunderstorms, you can get some really weird structures. We're used to the idea that if you have a thunderstorm, which I guess we're going to get in the next day or two, if you have a thunderstorm, you tend to get lightning from the thunderstorm down to ground. But relatively recently, it's been discovered that actually you can get lightning strikes above a cloud going off into space. This is something that we didn't know existed until relatively recently. They're called red sprites. And here they've been caught. You can't actually see, but there's a big thunderstorm off in the distance. And we're seeing effectively lightning upwards from a thunderstorm. We still don't fully understand what's going on. But if you do ever see it, it is absolutely amazing. If we look in more detail at what's going on in these red sprites, how can you not think that's an alien invasion if you were to ever see something like that? It's perfectly natural, but something that we don't fully understand, but we're fairly sure it is not alien invasion despite its appearance. If ever I talk to astronomers, they quickly pick up on the fact that if somebody says, I saw an arc-shaped UFO here from Ontario, somebody is saying, in the evening something caught my eye, brilliant white object in the evening sky. My conclusion, because I don't know what it is, my conclusion is this is a UFO. A knee-jerk reaction to the idea that if I can't identify it, it must be a UFO. This particular individual is saying, my friend thinks this object in the sky is as big as 2 airliners. Okay, the person reporting it says, well, I thought 1 airliner, but maybe he's right. The point is, if you don't know what it is you're looking at, and you don't know how far away it is, you can't possibly judge the size of this object. So on what basis are you saying that this is the size of an airliner? It could be a small object relatively close to you. It could be a huge object a long way away. If you don't know the distance, you don't know the size. And in this particular case, if you ask an astronomer, if you see a bright light in the evening sky after sunset, what's it likely to be? The answer is always Venus. A very bright light in the sky can be seen in the morning skies, can be seen in the evening skies. Venus goes through phases just like the moon. You tend not to notice those phases unless you're using binoculars or perhaps a zoom of a video camera. And then you notice that in this case, Venus is showing a sort of a crescent phase, hence this arc-shaped UFO. So, nothing unusual for any astronomer who knows about natural phenomena. We've talked about man-made objects, we've talked about natural objects. What about image artifacts? Here's a very old one taken from 1952 where people have said there appears to be a fleet of UFOs buzzing over Washington, DC. Well, maybe that's what we're looking at. But if you have a look at the image and have a look at what's going on down the bottom, there's a whole load of lights shining into the camera. If you take those lights and say, what if they were reflected? Let's turn them upside down and just move them up to the top there. Each of these little fireflies that we can see matches exactly to one of these street lights in the foreground. In other words, there's nothing mysterious here. We're simply looking at lights that are shining into the camera, producing a reflection. Every piece of glass which is trying to make an image will tend to reflect some of that light, and you will often get a reflection, generally speaking, upside down compared to the original image. So all of that is just reflected lights. And some people have said, look at this, this is a fantastic image of a UFO spacecraft. It came so close to the photographer that you could see windows in the image. This UFO sighting is 100% proof that aliens are here on Earth. You can tell that they're serious because A, it's 100%, and B, aliens is in capitals. That's how serious they are about this particular observation. But this is not something they saw. This is simply an artifact in the camera. They were photographing a very bright object, probably a full moon or something like that, and this very bright full moon is reflected in the lens of the camera and producing a very distorted image. Maybe there was a defect in the lens of some kind, producing a very odd-looking image. So no, they didn't see windows in this UFO. They didn't see the pilots waving at them. You wouldn't see anything when you photograph the sky. It's purely an artifact in the camera itself. And although those images were rather old, here's a more modern version of the same thing. I don't tend to spend much time looking at what's going on Twitter or X these days, but this I thought was sort of interesting. Somebody was trying to be arty to take a picture of this lamp bolted onto the side of a wall, and after they took the image, they said, what's this at the top there? There's something going on. This seems to have an aura around it. Hashtag UFO. And just to make it clear they were serious, hashtag serious question. They really wanted to know what this was. If I take that and blow it up a little bit, you can perhaps not really see the aura. There's a slight halo around it. But when you ask yourself, what is it that they were photographing here? Well, again, you can ask yourself, just like the streetlights or the moonlight of the previous image, what are we doing? We're photographing an object, and peeking out from behind that wall is the sun. A very, very, very bright object shining into the camera lens, producing a reflection. What would we expect to see? Well, the sun is a disk of light. Some of it is being obscured by this wall. So we would expect to find a circle that's been chopped in two, or something like that. And the sunlight is coming through the filigree work of this lamp stand. And therefore, we would expect to see a circular disc chopped into two, and we would expect to see a few shadows of the filigree work here. So that is exactly what you would expect to see if you were photographing an object shooting into the sun. And by the same argument, when you look at this, you can ask yourself what it is that this person thinks they saw. Well, they saw hovering in the sky a large, flat, rectangular aircraft with lights all the way around the edges, hovering in the air in front of them. UFO enthusiasts and conspiracy theorists have claimed it's an advanced type of spycraft known as the TR-3B. Notice how a certain amount of authority is lended to the situation once you start giving it letters. Rather than saying it's just a UFO, if you say it's not any old UFO, it's a TR-3B, it sounds like you know what you're talking about. But I looked at this and thought, I wonder what it is they're actually imaging here. Despite what this person has posted, I do not believe they saw anything floating in the sky. This looks to me like the windscreen of a car or a truck, and it was a rainy night. There's raindrops on the windscreen. And I think they are looking through the windscreen, and they are not looking at an object floating in the sky that's rectangular. I think it is much more likely that they've got an iPhone on their dashboard. And they are simply seeing a reflection of their iPhone, which can sometimes give you a glint around the edges. You can almost date which iPhone model it is by looking at the shape of the rectangle there. But almost certainly, you're just looking out on a rainy night and you're seeing a reflection in the windscreen. That is not something that was floating in the sky. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people out there who will deliberately fake images. Sometimes it's done for fun. Sometimes it's done for nefarious reasons. Sometimes it's done because they want you to click on their web page or their YouTube video so that they can get advertising revenue. If we have a picture like that, no one would assume that's real. If you need a finger pointing at it, then it's clearly not a real UFO. and nobody would assume that's real. If there was a spaceship a mile wide floating over an American freeway, I'm sure a lot of people would have seen it. And it won't be just one person who photographed it. We would have millions of people all photographing the same object. That doesn't happen. I looked at a few old images and wondered, is there any evidence whether these are real or these are fake? This is a very old image from 1966. I had a look at the UFOs and I had a look in the foreground. I believe those are tram lines. I'm not sure, but I think they're tram lines in the foreground there. If you look at the UFO and you look at the tram lines, the UFO is relatively blurred and the tram lines are very sharp. Now you could say, is that just a focusing issue? No, I don't think so. If you focus on the tram lines, effectively everything in the image ought to be in good focus. Is it the UFO moving? No, if it was the UFO moving, it would be blurred in one direction and not the other, depending on which way it's going. So in this particular case, somebody has taken an image and they've cut and pasted an image of a UFO and made the UFO a little bit blurry, thinking that that might look convincing, and they've blurred it too much. That is not a convincing image. This is the opposite problem where I looked at this. I know you can't see what's in the black rectangle there. They say that they've seen a triangular, shocking new footage of a ship over Chicago. I took the image and you can't see what's there, so I made it a little bit brighter so you can see what's there. Now you see that there is this triangular UFO sitting in the middle of the image. The blotchy background you can see is perfectly natural. When you take any image, there's always going to be some variation in the pixel values, in the brightness of, for instance, the background sky. So this sort of blotchiness is perfectly normal. But notice that the edges of the UFO are razor sharp compared to the blotchiness of the background. So this is the opposite problem of what we had last time. Somebody has taken a UFO image, plonked it into the middle of this image, and have made it too sharp. That's unconvincing for a real UFO. When people say, here's a UFO image of some alien spacecraft buzzing Air Force One as it's coming into land, they've tried to make it as blurred as Air Force One, but they've got the contrast wrong. When an object is miles away, which this particular trio of aircraft are, you would expect the atmosphere to blur some of the features and reduce the contrast, which is why Air Force One doesn't look black and white, it looks just muddy shades of grey. The UFOs themselves ought not to be as dark as they are, even if they are much darker than Air Force One. So again, they haven't quite got that right. Here is the deck of an aircraft carrier in which we're apparently seeing a US Air Force jet. It happens to be an F-18 jet. There's a helicopter and there's a triangular UFO at the top there. I looked at that image and I thought, I'm not very convinced that's real, but can I actually show that it's not real rather than just say my gut feeling is this does not look right? So given that my background is in analyzing and processing images, I said, well, let's have a look at some of the pixel values. Remember, whenever you take a real image, there's always a little bit of variation. Even if you're looking at something that looks uniformly grey, like the deck of the aircraft carrier, if you were to look at the actual brightness levels, and I'm looking at the brightness levels of various pixels along there, there's always a little bit of variation. Doesn't matter what the units are. So in this case, I'm graphing how bright are the pixels. They're roughly 70-ish units in brightness, and there's a little bit of variation as we go along the flight deck. That's perfectly normal. If we look at what's going on close to the triangular UFO, what's going on here? Perfectly normal variation, and then bam, dead flat, dead flat, dead flat, dead flat, and then it continues varying again. You do not get that in nature. Even though something looks uniformly grey or uniformly coloured, when you take an image of it, you're bound to get some variation. When you get a plateau like that, that is 100% a doctored image. This is quite definitely being faked. So it basically reinforces what I assumed in the first place. And the final picture from this particular category of UFO, here's somebody that says from an EasyJet passenger window, I looked over the wing, and then I saw this UFO fly by. Well, possibly, but I looked in detail at what this particular UFO was, and I thought, doesn't that bear a striking resemblance to one of the craft in a particular video game, which I'm not allowed to mention for legal reasons? It looks like that is simply somebody, again, cutting and pasting one of their favorite video game images into a video to try and claim, I saw this fly past my window. Nope, not convincing. Yes, of course, we are going to get far more fake images coming along because artificial intelligence can easily generate images that look sort of convincing but are actually fake. What I've been talking about so far are images from the past where people have tried to generate fake images and haven't done a particularly good job. In the future, it's going to become more and more difficult to separate real images from those generated by AI because AI is getting even better at generating realistic-looking images. So before I finish, let's deal with the fifth possible category. We've done man-made objects, we've done natural objects, we've done artifacts in the camera, nothing to do with what's out there, and we've done faking images. The fifth possibility is that UFOs are extraterrestrial spacecraft. To make our job easier, some people have actually documented all of the UFOs that exist. This is something I found, which is UFO sightings set 1, implying there's actually more than these 80, and they've each been categorized as to what does this flying saucer or object actually look like. So somebody has sat down and tried to collate lots of reports and then said, these are all of the UFO sightings that exist. Down at the bottom, you can't read it, but it says 80 UFO models based on actual sightings. So we're not basing it on images. We don't have images of these 80 objects. This is basically people saying, I saw something in the sky, it looked like a car hubcap or something, and or it looked rectangular, and that's how we ended up with this set of images. A little while ago, NASA was tasked with, let's review everything we've got so far. Let's have a look at all the UFO evidence and see if any of it stacks up. This was a few years back. After spending a few $1 million, NASA produced their report. They didn't call them UFOs at the time, they called them Unidentified Anomalous Phenomena. They're the new names for UFOs, UAPs. What did NASA conclude? Well, one of the things they said is that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If you remember a Carl Sagan quote that I said at the beginning of the talk. They also said metadata, the associated data with images, is often missing. In other words, we don't know when it was taken, what time of day, who took it, under what circumstances. If we don't have that associated data with any given image, it's very difficult to understand context, and that's the point they made. They finally concluded there is no conclusive evidence suggesting an extraterrestrial origin for UAPs. NASA spent millions producing that report. If they had come to me first, I could have told them all of this, saved them a few $1 million. But when you ask about extraterrestrial visitation, it does actually lead to a question. Because if there is no conclusive evidence for ever being visited by extraterrestrials, we can then ask, why not? Because if we look out into our Milky Way galaxy has something like 300 billion stars in it. When I was young, we didn't know how many stars had planets. It was literally, we had no idea. Since the last few years, certainly the last couple of decades, we've now got a much better idea of how many stars have planets going around them. And the answer is, apparently, most of them. At least half. So, if most have planets, that means we've got 150 billion stars with planets going around them. And most stars have more than one planet. A lot of stars might have half a dozen or a dozen planets going around. Quite a few of those planets we believe are Earth-like. We still need to do a lot more research to find all of these planets and to study them, But so far, of the thousands of planets that have been found circling other stars, a few of them have been found to be Earth-like. So we're not sure how many, but we think perhaps a third of them could be rocky planets like the Earth, and the others could be gas giants like Jupiter. So let's divide our number by 3. That means there are something like 50 billion Earth-like planets in our galaxy alone. We have no idea how likely it is that life exists on those planets. That's one of the reasons we're looking for life on Mars. We're looking for life on the moons of Jupiter to get an idea of how likely it is that life arises on any given planet. Some people say life is inevitable, given the right conditions, an Earth-like planet, liquid water, the right distance from the sun. Give it all of the ingredients, as they said in Jurassic Park, life will find a way. Some people believe it's very unlikely. Let's assume that there's only a 1 in 100 chance of life ever existing on an Earth-like planet. So let's take our number and divide by 100. That leaves us with 500 million planets in which life took hold. How likely it is that life goes from a bacteria to a multi-celled organism? Well, again, we don't know. Complex life, we just have to guess how likely that is until we actually find some. So let's assume that 99% of the time, even if life does arise, it doesn't go anywhere. So let's divide that number by 100 again. That gives us 5 million planets on which complex life has arisen. How likely it is that we get to intelligent life with a complex civilization, with technology in any way comparable to ours? Again, we have no idea. Let's assume 99% of the time it simply does not happen. So we have to divide that number by 100 again. That leaves us with 50,000 planets in our galaxy in which we might have a civilization comparable to our own. So if there are 50,000 civilizations out there, where are they? Why haven't we been visited? Do they simply think we're too boring and it's not worth visiting? Are they too far away? Do civilizations not last very long? So although lots of them crop up, maybe they destroy themselves after a few centuries and therefore there aren't actually many of them out there. That is still a very big debate. There are so many stars out there, surely there must be intelligent life somewhere out there in our galaxy. Where should we look? Because UFOs do not appear to be the answer. We only have one data point, and that data point is life did start here on Earth. We're not sure about Mars. We're not sure about the moons of Jupiter. We're looking to hopefully get a second or a third data point. But all we actually know is that that tiny blue pixel there, the pale blue dot, is the only place that life has ever developed. The pale blue dot, look again at that dot. That's here, that's home, that's us. On it, every human being who ever was lived out their lives on a mote of dust, suspended in a sunbeam. That's the quote from Carl Sagan in 1994, reminding us that that is the only place that we know life exists. What I find more unsettling than the idea that we might have been visited by extraterrestrials, I find it much more unsettling to think we might be alone. Thank you very much.